Welcome to the second week of our study course around themes of healing and wholeness. And once again, I'm delighted that Paula Good is here, and we're going to be continuing our conversation about aspects of healing, particularly the biblical material around this theme of healing and of wholeness. Paula, we're going to talk this week a little bit about some of those difficult issues of when healing doesn't seem to come, or it doesn't come as we expect it to be, and how we find ourselves living with our unhealed nature. I found myself preaching recently on the passage from Genesis about Jacob and the incident when he wrestles with a man through the night. And he names the place because he's seen the face of God. And yet, having seen the face of God, because his hip has been put out of joint, he walks away limping. And it seems to me there's a really powerful image there of how even when we encounter God, actually we may still find ourselves limping. And that image of Jacob walking away into the daybreak limping just seems to me to be a really graphic picture of how actually life is for us very often.
Absolutely agree. I mean, for me, I've always loved that story, and one of the reasons I love it is because it reminds us that our human instinct to ever greater perfection is maybe not what God really yearns for us, because there is something about the profundity of an encounter with God that changes you. And sometimes it can change you in a way that you wish it hadn't changed you, and yet it does. And so you get into some really complex territory there about what we yearn for and what God yearns for us, and they're not necessarily the same thing.
So how on earth do we begin to discern that? We have this aspiration to healing. We want to be not as we are, and yet here we're saying that actually that may not be the case, and yet we believe in a God who heals.
And I think it is one of the most difficult issues and the most difficult questions that we will encounter in Christian life. And there is no shortcut to it. And for me, one of the really important things is being very clear that there is no shortcut. And facile, happy answers help nobody. So we must all have been in a situation where we are struck by grief, or we're struggling with an ill health, and somebody will say, "Don't you worry, God wants it for you," or something along those lines.
Yes.
And it gets deeply offensive. And so therefore we have to be very careful when we're talking about this, about not doing the shortcut, because the shortcut is the offensive route. But the long cut is, I think, probably one of the really helpful and profound questions, which is about how we begin to respond to this question of what does it look like to be somebody who has long-term illness, long-term grief, long-term things that we do not wish for ourselves? How do we then begin to discern something of God in those situations?
We're asking people this week to look at a passage from 2 Corinthians, and it seems to me that actually in 2 Corinthians we've got an awful lot which is going to help us around here in trying to wrestle with some of this stuff. I mean, 2 Corinthians, the passage we're looking at, which is chapter 12, is Paul and his thorn in the flesh, however we conceive of that. What does that say to us?
It's one of my favourite passages in the whole of Paul. And what is amazing about it is that it's a passage of contrasts. If you read from the beginning of 2 Corinthians 12, Paul apparently starts off in this elaborate description of one of the best experiences where he has this religious experience, he's caught up into heaven, he gets to paradise, it's all glorious and fabulous, and it ends with a thorn in the flesh that won't go away. And you've got this paradox going on where he's explaining this incredible experience, but it comes with a punch, and the punch is the thorn in the flesh. And one of the really key things about the passage is that bit at the end where Paul says, 3 times I asked for it to be taken away, and 3 times Christ refused to do it, as though it was in fact the very thorn that helped Paul to understand something really crucial about who he was as an apostle. And the answer is the really big answer that we're wrestling with this week, which is Christ's power is made perfect in weakness. And one of the things that we need to do when we're wrestling with this is ask, actually, what does that mean for us as Christians? How do we begin to understand that in a way that is not, isn't it really great that you've got a thorn in the flesh, which is the shortcut version of the response to it?
So that begins to get quite difficult, doesn't it? Because, I mean, that's an experience, that experience of Paul asking 3 times, that many people will have had of some affliction of some sort which has been with them for ages. We were talking last week about the woman who for 12 years had the hemorrhage, and no doubt we know she tried everything under the sun to try and solve the issue. There we are with facing this reality. So what is it that Paul's drawing on which enables him to kind of resolve that? Well, perhaps resolve's not the right word, because you don't resolve it, but you somehow integrate it within your being and your life.
And you learn to live with it, most importantly. That recognition that there is actually something that is transformative in the awfulness. And one of the ways to understand this actually takes us back to 2 Corinthians 4.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I love 2 Corinthians as an epistle is that this is Paul in his rawness. This is Paul where his great vision of everything that's going to be fabulous and wonderful about being an apostle is coming to nothing.
Yes.
His relationships with the Corinthians are going wrong. He's struggling with ill health. And he's punished, he has shipwrecks, he's beaten. Everything is apparently going wrong. And in that, he begins to discover the real essence of being an apostle. And in 2 Corinthians 4, he kind of nails it and makes it clear, as he does, I think, again in 2 Corinthians 12. He talks in 2 Corinthians 4 about clay jars.
Yeah.
And it's an image that a lot of people like very much. It helps if you realise that in Corinth, the Corinthians were known for 2 types of pottery. One of them is the blackwork pottery, which is highly glazed, really beautiful and very, very valuable. The other end of the spectrum of the Corinthian pottery was terracotta jars that were made of very, very poor clay, often very thin, and as a result of being thin and made of poor clay, often had cracks in them. But they had a real purpose. The purpose of the terracotta jars was that you would put a light in them, and they would act, as we still have today, as a lamp infuser.
Yeah.
So the light kind of shines around the room better. And I think Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians 4 that one of the things you need to realise is that it is in your crackedness that actually the light of Christ can shine. If you are a beautiful blackwork piece of pottery, then everyone says, what a lovely piece of blackwork pottery. If you are a pot with cracks and weaknesses in it, people actually then have a hope of seeing the light that's shining out of you, which is Christ, and to have an encounter with Christ as he is, rather than the you as you wish people would see you.
So somehow in this, we're holding together our vision for healing, our desire to pray for healing, which we'll come to in a future session, our conviction that healing is part of God's purpose, with this reality that either healing may not come, or it may come in ways which look different from how we might have been expecting it to come, and we have to kind of learn to integrate that and live with it.
And it is a lifelong journey of integrating it and live with it, and trying to discern at what point you should expect healing appropriately, and at what point you learn to live with the experiences that you have, and how you wrestle between the two, and how you talk to other people about it, I think is a really crucial question.
So therefore we've got something here which enables us to talk with some credibility to people or to the relatives and close friends of people who are facing what seem like, in earthly terms, incurable conditions, that they've actually got no option but to live with. I mean, I think of the horrors of dementia and things like that, for example. And here might be something which actually speaks into those situations.
Absolutely so. And trying to find some kind of language that talks about the way in which Christ can be deeply and truly present in those awful moments of life, without saying, Christ likes you being like that, and it's getting that balance right, which is the important thing.
And we'll be talking in another session about the cross and about how actually our healing comes through his wounds, and presumably that feeds into this as well in some way.
Very much so, yes, that's right.
Thank you.